When American soldiers were captured during the Vietnam War, many believed they simply had to survive until the fighting ended, and they would be free. But once they entered Vietnam's prison system, that hope faded very quickly, because what happened inside those camps would test the limits of human endurance. Most American prisoners of war in Vietnam were pilots. The air war over North Vietnam was the largest American bombing campaign since World War II. When a jet was hit, the crew often only had seconds to eject. The force of ejection was extremely violent and frequently caused serious injuries. Broken arms, shattered legs, damaged backs, and other injuries were common. Many men entered prison camps already badly hurt, and those injuries affected everything that followed. If a pilot survived the ejection and landed safely, he was often surrounded within minutes. In rural areas, local civilians and militia usually reached down airmen before regular North Vietnamese soldiers arrived. The welcome was often brutal. Many pilots were beaten immediately. Some were stripped of their equipment and clothing. A few were killed before military forces even reached them. Navy Lieutenant Commander John McCain was shot down over Hanoi on October 26, 1967. His A-4 Skyhawk was struck by a missile over Truc Bac Lake. He ejected at high speed, breaking both arms and his right knee. Unconscious when he hit the water, he sank beneath the surface. Local people pulled him out, but a crowd quickly began beating him. One woman stepped in and stopped the attack, and she is widely credited with saving his life before soldiers arrived. By the time McCain reached prison, one broken arm had been stabbed with a bayonet. His fractured knee had received no treatment, and he had lost a large amount of blood. He weighed around 150 pounds when captured. At his lowest point in captivity, his weight dropped below 100 pounds. Army Special Forces Sergeant James Nick Rowe had a very different experience. He was captured on October 29, 1963, before the major air war began, making him one of the earliest American prisoners of the Vietnam conflict. He was taken in the Mekong Delta by Viet Cong guerrillas rather than the North Vietnamese military. The Viet Cong ran their prison system differently. Prisoners were kept in bamboo cages deep in the jungle and moved constantly to avoid rescue missions. Unlike the prison camps around Hanoi, there was no large organized camp network. Rowe survived for 5 years, partly because he convinced his captors that he was a low-ranking draftee instead of a highly trained Special Forces officer. When they eventually discovered the truth, they ordered his execution. Before it could happen, Rowe escaped on December 31st, 1968. American prisoners were held in a network of camps spread across North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and Laos. Conditions varied so much from one camp to another that a prisoner's location could mean the difference between survival and death. Kho Lo Prison, known to the Americans as the Hanoi Hilton, was the largest and best-known facility. Built by the French colonial government in 1896 to imprison Vietnamese political prisoners, it stood in the center of Hanoi. By the time American pilots began arriving in 1964 and 1965, the prison was old, crowded, and miserable. Some prisoners were kept in large communal cells, while others were confined to tiny isolation rooms, barely large enough to lie down in. Summer temperatures often climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. During winter, the stone walls became cold and damp. Blankets weren't provided. Rats moved through the prison freely, and mosquitoes were everywhere. The nickname Hanoi Hilton was a dark joke among the prisoners. Cu Loc Prison, which Americans called the Zoo, was a former movie studio on the southwest edge of Hanoi. It began holding American prisoners in 1965 and gained a reputation as one of the harshest torture centers in the entire system. Another camp called the Plantation was located closer to downtown Hanoi. The North Vietnamese sometimes brought foreign visitors and journalists there to show what they claimed were acceptable prison conditions. Torture still took place at the Plantation, but visits from outsiders occasionally resulted in slightly better treatment for short periods. The Briar Patch was a remote jungle camp about 45 miles west of Hanoi in mountainous terrain. Prisoners there faced harsh environmental conditions on top of captivity. Nights could become genuinely cold because of higher elevation. Medical care did not exist. Food there was even worse than at the camps around Hanoi. Many prisoners later said the environment itself felt like an enemy, with the jungle, cold weather, and isolation slowly wearing down both body and mind. The most severe isolation facility was a small, high-security compound known to prisoners as Alcatraz. It held only 11 men, all senior officers identified by the North Vietnamese as leaders of the prisoner resistance movement. Between 1967 and 1969, men such as Navy Commander James Stockdale, Air Force Colonel Robbie Reisner, and Navy Commander Jeremiah Denton were confined in separate cells, measuring roughly 7 feet by 7 feet. They were kept in leg irons and almost completely cut off from communication with other prisoners. Historians now consider their experience one of the harshest and longest periods of captivity endured by any American prisoners during the war. In South Vietnam and Laos, prisoners held by the Viet Cong faced a different kind of suffering. Bamboo cage camps in the Mekong Delta and jungle prison sites in Laos had no permanent facilities, unreliable food supplies, and even less access to medical care than the camps in North Vietnam. Army Sergeant Donald Cook was captured by the Viet Cong on December 31, 1964. He spent years in jungle camps, repeatedly refused offers of early release, and continued acting as the senior American prisoner. On July 8, 1967, he died from malaria and severe malnutrition. In 1980, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Marine to receive the award for service in Vietnam. The food in North Vietnamese prison camps was built around two basic items: rice and thin soup. Sometimes the soup contained pumpkin or cabbage. Once in a while, prisoners received a small piece of fatty pork, usually no more than once a week. Bread was sometimes issued in the Hanoi camps. Protein was extremely rare. Depending on the year and the camp, prisoners received roughly 700 to 1,500 calories per day. An adult man normally needs around 2,500 calories daily just to maintain his weight. Day after day, the prisoners were getting far less than their bodies needed. And the weight loss came quickly. Men who arrived weighing between 170 and 190 pounds often dropped to 130 or 140 within just a few months. Because there was so little protein, the body began consuming its own muscle. Arms and legs became thin, faces became hollow. Vitamin deficiency diseases appeared within months and eventually affected almost everyone. Beriberi, caused by a lack of vitamin B1, led to swollen legs, nerve damage, and sometimes heart failure. Pellagra, caused by a lack of niacin, damaged the skin and digestive system. Vitamin A deficiency caused night blindness, making it difficult to see in low light. These weren't minor health problems. Throughout history, untreated beriberi alone has killed countless people. And in prisoners already weakened by starvation, it could become deadly very quickly. Dysentery and intestinal parasites were common. Water in many camps was contaminated. Malaria was a constant danger in jungle camps and in areas with standing water. Without antibiotics or anti-malarial medicine, diseases that could normally be treated became life-threatening. Dental problems became widespread within the first year. Most prisoners had no toothbrushes and no dental care. So teeth decayed, and painful abscesses developed. A dental abscess might sound minor, but without antibiotics, it could spread through the bloodstream and become deadly. Many prisoners lost several teeth. Others suffered from severe jaw infections for years. The injuries caused by ejection from damaged aircraft were often left untreated or poorly treated. Broken bones, torn ligaments, damaged joints received only limited attention from Vietnamese medical staff. John McCain's broken arms and shattered knee were treated with a rough surgical procedure, but the work was poor, and he received no physical therapy afterward. He permanently lost much of the movement in both arms. James Stockdale had been shot in the leg before his capture and never received proper treatment. The leg healed incorrectly, and he walked with a noticeable limp for the rest of his life. One of the most remarkable things is how many prisoners survived years under these conditions. Part of the answer was age. The average American POW was only about 27 or 28 years old when captured. Most were still in the strongest years of their lives. Younger bodies can survive starvation and vitamin deficiencies longer before major organs begin to fail. The starvation and poor living conditions were only part of the story. Between 1965 and late 1969, the North Vietnamese military carried out a systematic torture program against American prisoners. The most common torture method was known as the ropes. Prisoners had their arms tied behind their backs. The ropes were pulled so tightly that circulation was cut off, and then the arms were forced upward toward the head. The human body is not designed to bend that way. Men screamed in pain. Shoulders were dislocated. Nerves were damaged. The torture continued until a prisoner agreed to sign or say whatever the interrogators wanted. Prisoners were also placed in ankle stocks, heavy wooden or metal devices that locked their legs into painful positions for long periods. Sleep deprivation was used constantly. Guards would bang on cell doors throughout the night, sometimes every few minutes for days at a time. Combined with hunger, pain, and isolation, these methods pushed many men close to complete mental collapse. American prisoners followed the Code of Conduct, a set of rules created after the Korean War in 1955. Under Article 5, they were supposed to give only their name, rank, service number, and date of birth. But the code had never been tested against years of organized torture. Most men eventually broke under enough pain. The military understood this, and so did the prisoners. Air Force Captain Lance C. John showed just how far that resistance could go. On November 9, 1967, his F-4 Phantom was shot down over Laos. He survived the crash with a fractured skull, a broken hand, and severe internal injuries. For 46 days he avoided capture, hiding in the jungle with almost no food and very little water. In January 1968, he was finally captured near the North Vietnamese border. Even after repeated torture sessions, he refused to provide information beyond his name and rank. He died later that month from his injuries and the effects of captivity. He was only 25 years old. After his death, he received the Medal of Honor and became the first graduate of the Air Force Academy to earn that award. What kept many prisoners mentally alive was not individual toughness alone. It was their connection to each other. They built that connection using something surprisingly simple. Navy Commander Bob Shoemaker, one of the first prisoners captured on February 11, 1965, helped develop and spread what became known as the TAP code. The system used a 5x5 letter grid. For example, 2 taps, a pause, and then 3 more taps represented one letter. 4 taps, a pause, and then 3 taps represented another. Using this system, prisoners who had not spoken to another person in months could send complete messages through the walls of their cells. It was slow. A single paragraph could take an hour to communicate, but it worked. Through the walls, prisoners exchanged news, jokes, encouragement, and information about newly captured Americans. When Stockdale was held in near total isolation at Alcatraz between 1967 and 69, the TAP code was often his only connection to the rest of the prisoner community. The North Vietnamese eventually discovered the system and punished anyone caught using it. Prisoners could be beaten, placed in solitary confinement for months, or subjected to additional interrogation sessions. But the communication never completely stopped. As the senior American officer in the Hanoi prison system, Stockdale used the TAP code to spread a set of instructions known as Back Us. These directives told prisoners to resist, avoid helping enemy propaganda whenever possible, and report any forced cooperation to senior officers afterwards. This helped prevent prisoners from carrying overwhelming guilt after breaking under torture. Stockdale personally took resistance to extreme levels. Before one planned propaganda appearance, he used a razor to cut his own face. On another occasion, he slammed his face into a concrete wall. These actions weren't signs of mental collapse. They were deliberate attempts to prevent the North Vietnamese from using him in propaganda films and photographs. In his own way, he was still leading the fight. By 1970, American intelligence had spent years trying to find the exact locations of POW camps across North Vietnam. On the night of November 20th and 21st, 1970, the United States launched the boldest prisoner rescue mission of the entire Vietnam War. Army Special Forces Colonel Arthur Bull Simons led 56 Special Forces soldiers in a helicopter assault on the Son Tay prison camp, about 23 miles west of Hanoi. The operation had been carefully planned and was carried out almost perfectly. There was just one problem. The camp was empty. American intelligence didn't know that the 61 prisoners once held there had been moved 4 months earlier because flooding had contaminated the camp's water supply. No prisoners were rescued. Simon and his men successfully escaped without losing a single American soldier, but the mission itself had failed. What happened afterward was completely unexpected. The North Vietnamese were alarmed that American forces had managed to reach a camp so close to Hanoi. In response, they quickly decided to move and consolidate many American prisoners. Men who had been held in isolated jungle camps, small prisons, or long periods of solitary confinement were transferred into larger prison blocks at the Hanoi Hilton. Some men who had gone years without meaningful human contact suddenly found themselves living with 40 or 50 other Americans. For many prisoners, this became the most important change of their entire captivity. Air Force Major George Day, who had escaped from a North Vietnamese prison camp in 1967 before being recaptured while trying to reach South Vietnam, later described the consolidation as a kind of resurrection. Without meaning to, the North Vietnamese had given the prisoners exactly what years of isolation had been designed to prevent. On September 2, 1969, Ho Chi Minh, the president of North Vietnam at the time, died. In the weeks that followed, prisoners began noticing changes inside the North Vietnamese prison system. The widespread use of rope torture and ankle stocks began to decrease. Food portions became slightly larger. The meals were still inadequate, but they helped to slow the worst effects of starvation. Some camps even allowed limited periods of outdoor exercise. At the same time, international attention was growing. Anti-war activists from the United States and Europe were visiting Hanoi and asking questions about how prisoners were being treated. The changes weren't driven by compassion. They were a strategic decision. By 1969, North Vietnam had already obtained much of what it wanted from its torture program. It had collected confessions, propaganda recordings, photographs, and signed statements from hundreds of American prisoners. Continuing the same level of torture brought fewer propaganda benefits while creating greater diplomatic problems. The policy changed, but the system itself did not suddenly become humane. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. Under Article 8A of the agreement, all American prisoners of war had to be released within 60 days. The return operation was called Operation Homecoming. It began on February 12, 1973, when a U.S. Air Force C-141 Starlifter landed at Gia Lam Airport in Hanoi and picked up the first group of 116 prisoners. The releases were organized according to how long each man had been imprisoned. The longest-held prisoners were sent home first. Everett Alvarez Jr., captured in August 1964, boarded the aircraft after spending 3,113 days in captivity. Jeremiah Denton, captured on July 18, 1965, was also on the first flight. When that plane finally left North Vietnamese airspace, many men who had survived years of torture, starvation, and isolation openly cried. The long-term effects often appeared years later. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which would not officially become a medical diagnosis until 1980, affected many former prisoners. John McCain's marriage eventually ended in divorce. James Stockdale struggled with alcohol after returning home. Robbie Reisner faced major difficulties adjusting to normal life. For many men, the damage caused by the prison camps did not end when they stepped off the plane. Yet many survivors also rebuilt remarkable lives. Stockdale received the Medal of Honor in 1976 and later became president of the Naval War College. Jeremiah Denton was elected to the United States Senate from Alabama in 1980. John McCain served 35 years in the Senate and became a presidential candidate in 2008. Of the 766 Americans held as prisoners of war, 591 returned alive. That equals a survival rate of about 77%. But the number can be misleading without context. Most of those deaths occurred before 1970 in remote jungle camps or among men who entered captivity with serious injuries. A prisoner captured after 1969, sent to a Hanoi prison and arriving without major injuries, had much better odds of survival than the overall statistics suggest. A prisoner captured in 1966, sent to a place like the Briar Patch or a Viet Cong jungle camp, and already suffering from broken bones, faced much worse odds. Among the men who survived, the average time spent in captivity was about 4 years. That period covered both the harshest years and the years when conditions began to improve. The evidence suggests that a young, healthy prisoner with strong mental discipline and access to the prisoner community could usually endure camp conditions for roughly 4 to 5 years before physical decline became severe.